All right. Well, welcome to the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center Tuesday Talk program. Ladies of the Lights, Michigan Women in the U.S. Lighthouse Service with author Patricia Majher. I'm Eric Alanik. I'm the director here at the History Center, and we're delighted to have you here today, watching from the comfort of your home and visitors from around the country right now. The mission of the Saugatuck-Douglas History Center is to preserve local history and inspire learning to inform and improve our community. We were founded as the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Society in 1986, and we're a volunteer-run organization, 700 members strong, that saves and shares the stories of Saugatuck-Douglas. You can see a photo of our schoolhouse campus in Douglas and our galleries where I'm coming to you today. We do have a full range of programming happening this summer in person and virtually. Next program will be on August 3rd here at the History Center, and it features one of our artists, Jason Weesaw, whose work is in the latest exhibit, Art of the People, Contemporary Anishinaabe Artists. This is a work with seven Native American artists from Michigan and the Great Lakes region, and a really exciting exhibit as part of the Saugatuck-Douglas Bentonville Arts Initiative due this summer. I want to take just a moment to thank our many sponsors for our organization and for our programming. The History Center is supported by the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Humanities. We also receive support from Michigan Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Allegheny County Community Foundation. I also want to thank our supporting members. As I mentioned before, this is a membership-based organization, and the vast majority of programming that we provide to the community is delivered free of charge, accessible to all. So for those of you who are members, thank you so much. You make all of our work possible. If you are not yet a member, please consider joining at our website, mysdhistory.org. We have some additional programming happening this summer. We kicked off our newest On the Road series this past Thursday at the museum, learning about the Mount Bulkhead radar station. There are 2 more programs in this series. The next will take place on August 5th at the Felt Mansion near Saugatuck-Douglas State Park. We'll have a chance to tour the unique spaces and places there and get an exclusive view of that site. And on August 19th, we head to the Oxbow School of Art for a tour of the creative buildings and landscapes there. These are ticketed events, and you can purchase tickets through our website for $25 each for this series. I'm really thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Patricia Majher, and she's giving a talk today that's based on her 2010 book, Ladies of the Lights, and we're really thrilled to have her here. She's coming to us today from Ann Arbor. Patricia is former editor of Michigan History Magazine and a museum professional working in positions at the Henry Ford, Mackinac State Historic Parks, as well as being an author and having her own consulting business as well. In addition to Ladies of the Light, she's published youth books on history, Great Girls in Michigan History, and Bold Boys in Michigan History with Wayne State University Press, and 100 Things to Do in Ann Arbor Before You Die from Reading Press. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Patricia. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing lots of great stories from the Great Lakes.
Thank you, Eric, and hello to my West Michigan friends and acquaintances. I wish I could be there with you. I was kindly invited by Eric and his Historical Society to speak on this subject. And as he said, it is the subject of a book that I wrote in 2010, which in the business we would call it evergreen, or an evergreen topic, very popular over the years. I still get a dozen requests to speak on this topic every year. And I think it's because we don't hear so much about the women in this field. We think of it as a fairly, field dominated by men, and it certainly was. But Michigan had the most female lighthouse keepers in the United States. So I think that's something to celebrate. So with that little introduction, let's lead into the first slide. Just a little something to give you a background in terms of lighthouse keeping in general. In the US, the very first lighthouse keeper was George Worthylake, and he served in Boston Harbor starting in 1716. And from that point, lighthouses became a federal responsibility. The first female keeper came along about 60 years later. She also served in Massachusetts at a place called Granite Point, north of Boston. And she actually had filled in for her husband when he went off to war, and then he died in war, in the Revolutionary War, and then she took on the responsibility full time. On the Great Lakes, and I mean the American side, I'm afraid I don't know the Canadian history side of this. Our first female here our first female in the Great Lakes served in Ohio at Marblehead near Cedar Point, and her name was Rachel Wolcott. And she too succeeded a husband who died, and he died of cholera while in the service, the lighthouse service. So she took over for him after that period until she remarried, and then that person became the keeper. And then right here in Michigan, our first female was Catherine Shook, and she served at Point O'Bark, which is at the tip of the thumb. She took over in 1849, also for a husband who died. He was the keeper prior to that point. Next. There were some differences between the way women and men were treated in the lighthouse service. One was the method of appointment. For men, it was often a sort of a step after the military. So, a step after the Civil War, they would, having served there, they would be rewarded with a lighthouse assignment. And it could also just be almost a political favor that, some candidate had felt that someone really supported his campaign. And so he said, well, I'll make you the keeper at whatever light. Women, as I've already underscored, generally tended to serve as a result of succeeding their husband who died in that position. Uniform requirements were different between men and women. If you've ever visited If you've ever visited a lighthouse in Michigan, you've probably seen someone dressed as a keeper in their dress blue outfit. That's not what they wore every day, but it was their official uniform. Women had no clothing requirements, and I'm guessing that's because they never thought women were going to be a long-term solution in the lighthouse service, so they didn't bother to create a uniform. But most women served in the 19th century, so we can expect that they wore long skirts and high heeled boots, and which was probably a little dangerous when you're dealing with flammable liquids, but that was what women wore in that time. Another difference between men and women, how they were treated, was where they could serve. Women were not allowed to serve at isolated lights, and that was generally an island light, nor on light ships, which are literally ships that are moored usually over a shoal to prevent sailors from running their boats into it. In both of those cases, there was an obvious safety issue there, worrying about women in those either isolated or situations where they were with a group of men. Sometimes 4 or 5 people would serve on a light ship. Most women were not allowed to manage male assistants, with a couple of exceptions in Michigan. And their list of responsibilities was actually the same, with the one exception. If you happen to have a lighthouse that had a kind of tower, conical tower, let's say, that required painting, that was a job that you had to do starting from the top, sitting in a bosun's chair and lowering yourself down by pulleys. And that was regarded as rather unladylike to do when you were wearing your long skirts. So women were allowed to hire outside help to do that job. Other than that, they did everything else. And interestingly, women and men were both paid the same for their position. And that was rare at the time, rarer at the time than even now. And I know the first female lighthouse keeper in Michigan, Catherine Shook, she made $300 a year, which was exactly what her husband made prior to his death. Next. Just again, kind of a broad sense of the statistics involving Michigan female lighthouse keepers. From the very first keeper to the very last one, it was more than 100 years of service. The females in the lighthouse service left before the males did. The last man to serve in the lighthouse service in Michigan served until 1983. And there were 52 known female lighthouse keepers and assistant keepers in our state, as I mentioned earlier, more than any other state in the Union. And the reason why I put the word known in is that if you read the lighthouse logs and in official records of the service, sometimes a person is listed only by their first initial. So we don't know who, that could be Sally or it could be Samuel. We don't know who S something was. But 52 is a sizable number, and we should be proud of that. And those women served at 42 lighthouses on Lakes Huron, Michigan, Superior, and the Detroit River. There were no females who served on Lake Erie, in the part of Lake Erie that is in Michigan waters. Next. Women were, even though they generally fell into their jobs in a fortuitous or unfortunate, I should say, way, they tended to serve longer than men did. The Michigan women served 5.5 years, it's an average, and 9 of those served for 10 years or more. Most succeeded a deceased husband, or often it was a husband who was absent for a period of time during war. And several of these women were part of keeper families, multiple generations who served in Michigan. On Lake Michigan, that most prominent family was the Sheridans. Up in Lake Superior, it was the Corrigan family. And over in Lake Huron, it was the Garrity family. I don't know if this is significant, but those are all Irish families. So I don't know why they were drawn to that, but so some of the females that you hear about were actually part of these families. Next. Our first Lady of the Light served so early, we don't have a picture of her, unfortunately. Her name was Catherine Shook, and the years in the parentheses are her birth and death dates. She served at Point O'Bark, tip of the thumb, and her husband had just become the lighthouse keeper in 1848, and then he drowned in the lake, and so a year later she became the keeper, and she had 8 children to raise in what was really a wild area at that time. I mean, there was, the only way you got any place was, by an Indian trail or around the thumb by water. So it was very closed off from the rest of the few people who lived in Michigan at that time. And quite soon after Catherine took over, their family was burned out of the keeper cottage. And that was determined to be a problem with how the chimney in the cottage was constructed. But that was cold comfort, as then this was in March, they were basically forced to live in a lean-to that they constructed until the lighthouse service could send someone up there to build them something better. And when that ship arrived with supplies, they wouldn't allow Catherine to sign for it because she was a woman. And so her eldest son had to sign for the materials to create that cottage. And Catherine served for 2 years before she moved on. And, you know, we don't have a picture of her. We don't know what happened to her after that point, except she died 9 years after that. But because she had 8 children and those children had children and so on, there are many Shook descendants throughout Michigan, and I have often encountered them when I've done my talks. Next. I call this the Legacy Lady of the Light. This person, this is Anna Garrity, because she's part of that Garrity family that served on Lake Huron. She and her mother both served. Anna was the principal keeper of one of the Presqu'île lighthouses, and Mary was assistant keeper to her husband, also in that group of lighthouses. And as I make the point here, they're the only 2 lighthouse keepers we know that were related among the women. And that keeper family served 184 years in that area. And I like to note this, that there is a really great statue dedicated to Anna Garrity up at the Presqu'île Lights. And she's the only female lighthouse keeper in Michigan who has a statue. And she was the second longest serving woman in the state at 23 years. She served into the 1920s. So she was one of the women who bridged the 19th and 20th century. Next. This is Julia Braun, and persevering is the word for her service. She had one of those husbands who was a Civil War vet, and he came back from the war with an injury and ultimately died of it while in the lighthouse service. So she took over. And one of the things that she did during her term was to oversee the construction of the current lighthouse, which is at the mouth of the Saginaw River, very close to the Bay City's downtown. And she served as a keeper until she married again. And she married a man who had some maritime experience, so they made him the principal keeper and demoted her to assistant keeper. But that was fine because it still enabled them to bring in 2 paychecks from the federal government. But then in 1882, her position was abolished. And I have found evidence that another woman in Michigan was actually Mary Garrity up in the Presqu'île area. Her position was abolished in 1882, as well as a woman on the Wisconsin side of Lake Michigan. So I haven't unfortunately had the time to delve much deeper into that, but I'm guessing that there was a movement at that point in the service to phase out women. And it was easy enough to do that when there was somebody in place. They weren't phasing out the women who were principal keepers, but these women were all assistant keepers. So, but interestingly, 6 months later, they reinstated the position and hired men. So there was that. Next. This is a picture of the longest serving Lady of the Light. Her name was Elizabeth Whitney Williams, and she served at Beaver Island, Harbor Light, and at Little Traverse Light for a combined 41 years, which is pretty astounding. Although that's the record for Michigan, but it's not the record for the Great Lakes. There was a woman who served in Indiana, and she served for 43 years. And the national record holder served for 51 years in Mississippi. But still, we're very proud of Elizabeth Whitney Williams. She's really the one lighthouse keeper in Michigan who's mentioned in national books, but partly because she served so long, partly because she served at 2 lights, so she came to 1 light as a result of her husband drowning, replaced him, but then she got the opportunity to serve at a 2nd light, all on her own merit. And then she remarried along the way and requested the transfer to that 2nd light, and that was on the mainland by Harbor Springs. But she's also noted for having written an autobiography. It's called Child of the Sea. And she was born on Mackinac Island, and she was raised on Beaver Island. And then when she and her husband married, they spent time on Fox Island. So she really has this sense of what it meant to live in the 19th century on these islands in northern Michigan, and she writes about that to a great degree. She was also one of the families on Beaver Island when all of the non-Mormons were kicked off the island. There was a man there named Jesse James Strang who declared himself king of Beaver Island, and he had his own contingent of Mormons, and they were very dedicated to him, and ultimately they decided they wanted the island to themselves. So, these non-Mormons, which they called Gentiles, were kicked off at one point. And if you know the story about Strang, two of his followers murdered him. And so that pretty much caused the end of that community. And so then everyone moved back, and Elizabeth's family was one of those families that went back. So she writes about that as well. She writes about Native American history in the area in her book. It's really a charming read, and it's been reprinted, so you can find it in maybe even in your local library. Also about Elizabeth, which I think is kind of interesting, I mentioned that she's known nationally and was mentioned in several books that are written about the entire scope of female lighthouse keepers in our country. But there's also a very, very delightful children's book written about her. And so if you have a child who's interested in that, in that sort of thing, you might be interested in reading about this amazing woman. Next. Not every woman who served as a lighthouse keeper came to the job with enthusiasm, and one of those was Lucy Graemer. She was married to a man named Gus Graemer, who served as the keeper for the Ecorse Range Light in the Detroit River. And he led a very adventurous life before he became a keeper. He went to sea as a young man and was shipwrecked, and served on a whaling ship and also for the U.S. Navy at some point, and just had that wanderlust about him. And then at one point just gave that all up and became a light keeper, which was a very sedentary job, kept him on the island in the Detroit River, which was obviously a frustration to him, although it was a good paying federal job. When the Spanish-American War broke out in the 1890s, he sort of leapt at the chance, and a number of lighthouse keepers did, to go and fight in that war. And that only lasted for 6 months, so he came back pretty quickly. But he left his wife as the keeper in his place during that absence, and she had just given birth to a son. I can only imagine how challenging that was to, have this newborn and then also be so responsible for a light in an important waterway like the Detroit River. So things got a little rocky between the two of them as a result. And so when he came back, she told him she wanted a divorce, and he did not. And so he actually called up a reporter at the Detroit Tribune newspaper and gave an account of their relationship to that reporter, and which of course infuriated Lucy. And then she talked to the reporter, so they kind of aired their dirty laundry out in the public eye with this Detroit Tribune situation. She did eventually get a divorce and moved away, and he married again. And Lighthouse records show that he actually left her in charge, second wife in charge of the lighthouse, when he went off for a several-week period on his own. So Gus was probably not meant to be a lighthouse keeper, but Lucy didn't appear to enjoy it any more than he did. Next. This is probably my favorite Lady of the Light, and she happened to be the one who served at the end of the lighthouse keeping era for women. Her name is Frances Worry Johnson, and she was actually from Pontiac, and she was a woman who worked in business, and I believe for a department store there. And she vacationed one summer on Lake Michigan near the White River Lighthouse. And she just happened to come across a dog on the beach, really, enjoyed playing with the dog, and then the dog started running off. So she followed him to the lighthouse, and it was the owner, the keeper was the owner of the dog. So they got to know each other. And when she went back, he continued to write to her and she to him. And ultimately she did move there and marry him. And White River is near Muskegon and Whitehall on Lake Michigan. It's a very picturesque lighthouse, looks like a schoolhouse. It's not a very large one, or it doesn't have a very large light, and that's because it was not guarding the entrance to a harbor. It really was mostly concerned with pleasure boat traffic that came out of the lake and into the White River. So we'll just say it was sort of a minor lighthouse in that respect. They also had a rocky marriage, mostly because her husband essentially left all of the responsibilities to her while he went and hunted and fished and kind of carried on. So they got a divorce, and he left for his home in the Upper Peninsula. She went back to Pontiac. And very soon after that, she came to regret her decision. She loved being the light keeper, except for the fact that she had to do everything. And so she petitioned the Coast Guard, which had taken over the light service responsibilities, to return. And because she had such a good record when she was there with her husband, and obviously she knew everything there was to do, the Coast Guard welcomed her back, and she was not a military member of the Coast Guard. She was a civilian. But she's the only Michigan female who served during that Coast Guard period. And as I mentioned, it was not a lighthouse that protected a major harbor. But as you well know, up and down Lake Michigan, there are those rip tides and dangerous currents that people who come to visit and swim in the lake may not recognize the dangers. So she ended up being quite a lifesaver. She, would hear someone crying out, help, help, or see someone, trying to wave their arms in the water. And she'd come running down the beach and jump in and save people from, probably certain death. And she was a relatively small person. I mean, like 5 feet tall, and pretty much as she looks in this photograph, not a big bone girl. But she did save many lives that way. And in one case, she saved a woman who was much bigger than she was. And that wouldn't have been a problem, except the woman was panicking. And so she was sort of flailing at Frances. And Frances was concerned, for the safety of both of them. So she actually socked that woman in the jaw, which was enough to stun her. And they got back to land safely. And And the woman asked, why did you do that? Why did you hit me? And Frances said, well, if I hadn't, we both would have gone under. So she was pretty well known for that in the local area, that if you were up near her part of Lake Michigan and you were in danger, she might be the one to save you. Next. There were some tragedies among the ladies of the lights, as you might expect, as there were among the men who served. This is a picture of Julia Sheridan, and she was assistant to her husband on South Manitou Island in Lake Michigan, and they had 5 children. One day, she and her husband and her youngest child, who was not even a year old, decided to go to the mainland, and they were taken there by a friend who owned a boat. On the way back, they encountered bad weather and the boat capsized, and all but the boat owner died. And I can just imagine what a sad story that was. I mean, the 4 children waiting back at the island, wondering why their parents weren't coming. And then to hear that they had died along with their youngest sibling, just a terrible tale in that family's history. But interestingly, one of their sons ended up becoming a lighthouse keeper. It obviously, impacted him, but in a different way. And they're one of these multiple generation families who took up lighthouse keeping as their family business. Another tragedy was in the Upper Peninsula around Escanaba with a woman named Mary Terry. She was the keeper there, and she was known for being very frugal, and at the same time using her money to buy some properties in Escanaba. And lighthouse keepers didn't make a lot of money, but she saved her money. She was a single woman, and she made the most of it. And one night there was a fire at the lighthouse, which is a little bit outside of town, and so it probably burned. Being a wooden lighthouse, probably burned for some time before anyone noticed. And by the time they did, both the lighthouse, was a total loss, and Mary Terry's body was found dead inside. There was an inquiry into her death, and it wasn't an inquiry that had a conclusion, unfortunately, except that it seemed that the door was ajar. So there was, some sort of speculation about whether perhaps someone had tried to rob her and, set the fire to cover it up, or something had gone wrong and maybe Mary fought back, and, or perhaps there was some sort of assault involved. Nobody knows what really happened to Mary Terry, which is a sad, again, another sad tale from the Lighthouse Service in Michigan. And then Anna Garrity, I mentioned early on, a member of that Garrity family from Lake Huron. When she was growing up, her father was a lighthouse keeper and her mother was the assistant. And then there were the children that lived in the keeper's cottage with them. When Anna was a teen, one of her father's other assistants, because it was a big lighthouse, actually assaulted her. And there was, if you know much about lighthouse keepers, they were required to keep a log of every day's activities, even if it was just something like, a visitor or a weather pattern or something. But in the day that Anna was assaulted, her father actually wrote that she was raped. And the man who did that was arrested and taken to jail. Unfortunately, the records of what happened to him, at least from the civil standpoint or criminal standpoint, were lost in a fire. But we do know that he was fired from the Lighthouse Service as a result of his act. And again, sort of like Julia Sheridan's son becoming a lighthouse keeper, Anna was not put off and discouraged by this. This event occurred in her life, and she, just knew that she loved to deal with the mariners who came by, and she was dedicated to that life, and so she went on to become a lighthouse keeper herself. Next. And there were triumphs among the ladies. This is a picture of Anastasia Truckee, and she served in Marquette Harbor. And her husband was one of the men who left their wife in charge to go, in this case, to serve in the Civil War. And she served in her own way in that war, keeping that critical light lit and ensuring the safety of ships that came into Marquette to load up iron ore, which was then taken to points south and in Lake Huron, Lake Erie, where they could use that ore to create things like rails for railroads or cannonballs or anything, iron that was needed in the service of the war. So she did her part and he did his part. As we already learned about Elizabeth Whitney Williams being the first keeper at a new light, which was the Little Traverse Light. That was really an honor. That was something that was reserved for people who had exemplary records, and it was considered to be a bit of a reward for that service. So the fact that Elizabeth was immediately selected to be that person to serve, that was a wonderful honor in her book of her journey as a keeper. And then two women managed male assistants, Jane Enos, who served at St. Joseph Light on Lake Michigan, and Anna Garrity managed a male assistant. So again, that was an honor and was a recognition of their service and leadership. Next. This was probably more a function of the time, or perhaps a function of being at an isolated lighthouse. But a lot of lighthouse families were big, and so many of the women were mothers of what would be by today's standards extremely large families. This is a picture of Mary Corrigan, and she married into the Corrigan family of lighthouse keepers in Lake Superior, and she gave birth to her first child in the lighthouse boat as her husband was trying to rush her to the mainland from their island lighthouse. And when she gave birth in the boat, so her husband just turned the boat around and sailed back to the island. And she had 8 children, and one of those became a lighthouse keeper. And then Squaw Point, which is a lighthouse that doesn't stand anymore, but it was near Escanaba. That particular lighthouse had a keeper named Catherine Marvin, and she was really the record holder among mothers who were lighthouse keepers with 10 children. Not all of those were little when she became the lighthouse keeper, but half of them were. But the advantage obviously was the more hands make light work, or many hands make light work. So she, I'm sure, was assisted by her children in many of the tasks around the lighthouse, and that was true whether you were a male keeper or a female keeper. Your children were almost, well, they were unpaid help. Let's just put it that way. They were almost employees of the lighthouse service themselves. Next. We don't know a lot about the women who served in Michigan after they served. Here are a couple we do know about. This is a picture of Caroline Lidegatt Antaya, and I don't know if her middle name there, which is actually her first married name, Lidegatt, is familiar to any of you, but she was Henry Ford's aunt by marriage. Her husband, Barney, was Henry Ford's mother's brother. And she served at Mama Judah Light in the Detroit River. Her husband was another one of those Civil War veterans who came back with an injury, and it wasn't long before he died, and she took over service at that light for him. And he had 2 children together. And she served for many years, and then she found another husband, but he happened to live up in Port Huron. She was down by Detroit, he was up in Port Huron. And they they actually managed to have that long distance relationship as man and wife for a while until she became pregnant. And she decided that was time to kind of close up that chapter of her life and move herself and her new baby daughter to up to Port Huron, where her husband lived. Frances Johnson, that we talked about, who served at White River, when she left the Coast Guard, and because she had business experience, she was able to sort of slip into the business world in the area around where she lived. She became an office manager for a Muskegon business and retired from them with the gold watch, at age 65. So she went on to an entirely different career. They had nothing to do with, the lakes or sailors or anything. And of course, others probably remarried as well, changed their names as a result, and we lose them in genealogy studies of records, unfortunately. So that becomes almost a mystery in itself, what happened to these women. But given that most of them served in the 19th century, I think we can imagine they probably did not serve in another position that was prestigious and paid well. That wouldn't have been something that they had the opportunity to do after their lighthouse days were over. So we don't know, but someday somebody will have the time to track down those women, I hope. Next. Frances Johnson passed away in 2011, so 10 years ago now. And she, in one of my previous jobs, which was assistant director of the Women's Museum in Lansing, I actually did an exhibit on these female lighthouse keepers. And when I found out she was still alive, I drove up to her home outside of Muskegon and interviewed her, and I've got the transcript of that in my book. But she actually was gracious enough when we opened the exhibit to come down, and she was our keynote speaker. Really delightful and kind of sassy lady. One of the things that she pulled out to show me when I went to talk to her was not any memorabilia from her lighthouse days. It was instead a bulletin board of photos and memorabilia that proved that she had been on What's My Line. If any of you recall that TV show, I think they've actually brought it back with modern hosts lately, but it was stumping the panel. Could you figure out who this person was or what their profession was? And she did stump the panel. The best that the panel could do was they narrowed down that she was somewhere in Western Michigan, and they guessed that she had something to do with Kellogg's. Obviously she didn't, so she went away with a check for $50, and she had gotten a free train ride, to New York City and back, and that was really, what she thought she was famous for. And when I interviewed her, I said, well, that's wonderful, but you do realize how important you are in Michigan history for what you did here, what you did as a keeper. And she just kind of shrugged and said, well, that may be, but that's for others to decide. So I really was excited to have an opportunity to meet this woman who was, a link to this aspect of maritime history, and so glad that she participated in our exhibit. So she was have quite fond memories of this person I was able to connect to. So that's the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions that might have come up during my talk.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. That was really fascinating to see the significance of women lighthouse keepers, and the significance, particularly for Michigan, which of course has lots of borders on the Great Lakes, but of course lots of lighthouses too.
Mhm.
We'd love to open up the discussion for questions. I see a couple here in the chat. The first is, what were the daily, nightly routine for a keeper? What was their daily life like?
Well, surprisingly, it almost seems like they had a 24-hour job. Nighttime was really where their greater responsibilities came to the fore. They were required from sunset to sunrise to keep the light lit in their lighthouse. And, early on, that was involved burning oil in some way. And later on, when electricity came to lighthouses, they were able to, to switch to that as well. But that didn't relieve them from the responsibility of making sure the light was lit, because, electrical things can fail too. So they would usually check a couple of times a night. And on a really stormy night, may stay up the whole night to make sure that nothing was, disturbing the light, and that they weren't themselves observing something out in the water that needed to be attended to. So nighttime was work time for sure. Daytime was more a function of keeping the light station, which is the land that the lighthouse stood on, as well as all the other buildings, in good shape. And they would have to welcome visitors who were allowed to come just, whenever. Welcome visitors, polish the brass. You always hear about that if you visit a lighthouse, lots of brass. Clean the windows and the lantern room at the top, and maintain machinery. And there was some machinery involved in rotating the lights, and there was machinery in operating foghorns. And initially foghorns were coal, basically steam driven, so you would have to shovel coal in there. So very physical job. And then the lighthouse service itself was a kind of a stickler for cleanliness. So, they would come periodically and do the white glove treatment. And, I know there were stories of people getting, demerits, if you will, for having a dirty frying pan, really minor stuff. But I guess, that teaches you to keep an eye on everything. So anyway, daily was sort of housekeeping, if you will, but on a much larger scale, and keeping records. And nighttime was really the responsibility for the safety of any sailors that were out on the lakes.
A related question to that: how were first children educated?
It depended upon where you were stationed. If you were at a lighthouse that was on the mainland and close to a community, like Marquette, for instance, your kids would just go to school at the community schools. And in some cases, if you were located a little more remotely from a nearby town, your kids might stay in town, and you would only see them on the weekends or whatever. If you were on an island, it was much like we experience homeschooling today. The parents were in charge of that, and the Lighthouse service helped where they could, providing these books that came in boxes that, moved from lighthouse to lighthouse, and there might be an atlas, and there might be a Bible and an English grammar book, and all sorts of kind of reference works, as well as newspapers, current newspapers and magazines. So those things were also used to educate children.
Great. Any other questions from our audience? Feel free to turn on your camera or unmute if you've got a question you'd like to ask.
I don't know if anybody's interested in where on Lake Michigan women served, but if you start from the southern part, southwest part of Michigan, St. Joseph was a first light where women served, geographically first. And then you have to go all the way up to Grand Haven before you find a group of about 5 or 6 lighthouses, Pentwater, Little Sauble, Big Sauble. And then there's sort of a jump up to the Traverse area, and up to the bridge. So that between, in that sweep of the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, there were about 14 or 15 females who served. And along that stretch, one of them, and it was the only account I had seen of bad behavior. One was removed for bad behavior. Her name was Annie McGuire. She served at Pentwater, and she succeeded a husband who died in the service. So she was there for like 8 years, but all of a sudden reports started popping up about her being drunk and other behaviors which were not made specific. Anyway, within a week of seeing that, the Lighthouse Service took her off the job and she was replaced. But that was the only account I found of any women who didn't serve in a responsible way. So I think that's pretty good, 1 out of 52.
Well, that's great. Lots of good inspiration to go visit historic sites. Do I hear someone asking a question? I hear some noise in the background. No. All right. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Patricia, for joining us here on Zoom, and for all of you attending today. This program will be available on YouTube later today. Please join us in person next Tuesday for Jason Weesaw, an artist talk connected with the art of the people, contemporary Anishinaabe art. Bring a chair. We will be meeting out in the garden, and look forward to seeing you then.